December 27th, 2000.
Faces of children, husbands, and fathers.
They were so young. They were just really starting their lives.
Hemophiliacs who died before their time from AIDS.
He had to be turned every 2 hours, and he went blind with it.
The blood product that made it possible for them to lead normal lives was infected with HIV.
I thought I was helping them, and I was actually killing them. It's not normal. Mothers give life. They don't take it away.
Could anything have been done to prevent this tragedy?
It did not have to happen to these people.
Tonight, tainted blood, agonizing questions, and no easy answers.
From ABC News, this is Nightline. Substituting for Ted Koppel and reporting from Washington, Cynthia McFadden.
It has been called the worst medically induced calamity in American history, and very few people even knew it was happening. Between 7,000 and 10,000 hemophiliacs infected with HIV by medicine that was supposed to protect them from bleeding to death. Think back 20 years ago to when the AIDS epidemic struck, when no one knew for sure how the disease was transmitted. Was it airborne? Could you get it by kissing? Some of our own cameramen refused to go into the homes of victims. Schools refused admission to children with the disease. Finally, in 1982, the death of a baby who had received a transfusion and who had no other risk factors persuaded scientists the disease was transmitted through blood. But what ended up killing thousands of hemophiliacs was not blood transfusions, but a white powder, a medicine called Factor VIII. Factor VIII was a clotting medicine which doubled the lifespan of most hemophiliacs. It allowed children with hemophilia to go out and play without the fear of bleeding to death. But the white powder was made from blood, and it turns out was contaminated with HIV. Now, 2 decades later, many of the families of those who died from AIDS call the behavior of the drug companies genocide. The makers of Factor VIII refuse repeated requests from Nightline to address this issue on camera, although a background briefing was provided. Were hemophiliacs treated as the canaries in the coal mine of the nation's blood supply, expendable like the birds miners would send below to see if the air was safe to breathe? Was everything done that could have been done to protect the blood supply and save the lives of these innocents? The Pipert brothers were all born with hemophilia, and thanks to Factor VIII, says their mother May, all inherited great expectations.
They could get married and buy a house and, you know, do all the things that other guys could do when they grew up.
Factor VIII not only doubled the lifespan of most hemophiliacs, it enabled them to inject the blood clotting factor in the convenience of their own homes. But Factor VIII, made from the plasma donations of anywhere from 20,000 to 100,000 donors, also came with a significant downside. If one of those donors was infected with a blood-borne virus, the Factor VIII would be contaminated. Many hemophiliacs, for example, were exposed to the hepatitis virus in the 1970s.
From ABC, this is World News Tonight.
A potentially fatal disease, unknown just months ago, is spreading so quickly.
And that's how the miracle became the nightmare. AIDS spread from gay men to IV drug users and, inevitably, to hemophiliacs.
One option is to establish guidelines to keep people who are at high risk from donating blood to begin with.
This is how Hollywood recreated a meeting between the Centers for Disease Control and the blood industry in January 1983. One of the CDC's lead investigators, Don Francis, erupted at what he saw as intransigence by all attending. Actor Matthew Modine played Francis.
How many dead hemophiliacs do you need? How many people have to die to make it cost efficient for you people to do something about it? 100? 1,000? Give us a number so we won't annoy you again until the amount of money you begin spending on lawsuits makes it more profitable for you to save people than to kill them.
And by that time, the number of cases had doubled already in the hemophiliacs. And then what was really disturbing was that somewhere between a third and a half of the hemophiliacs had marked abnormalities of their immune system.
When we heard about the problem of AIDS from the CDC, we took action right away.
From 1978 to 1983, Tom Dries was president of Alpha Corporation, one of the 4 makers of Factor VIII.
We decided that we would ask every donor, every male donor, if he was a homosexual.
Don Francis believed that was the least they could do.
It was minimal. Getting gay donors out of the plasma collection was done by some. At least they were required by the FDA, but it was done relatively passively with a written questionnaire.
Since infection meant certain and painful death at this point in the epidemic, Don Francis wrote to his boss that the CDC should publicly recommend to hemophiliacs that with regard to Factor VIII use only small pool, less than 100 donors, concentrate, or go back to using cryoprecipitate, or cryo for short, the treatment used by hemophiliacs before Factor VIII came along.
It was clumsy, it was slower, the kids maybe wouldn't be able to go out and play quite so quickly.
Not just clumsy, says the industry, but life-threatening. With cryo, it took hours to stop internal bleeding. With Factor VIII, it could take just minutes. And cryo was, at that time, in short supply. And besides, says the industry, no one back then had scientific proof of what was causing AIDS. Don Francis knew otherwise.
It's hard to explain gay men, IV drug users, and hemophiliacs under any sort of rubric other than a virus that's transmissible by blood.
Francis acknowledged in his memo that for hemophiliacs, I fear it might be too late. 1/3 to 1/2 of hemophiliacs might already be exposed. Despite this grim picture, Francis goes on, we should do our utmost to prevent further exposure. But no such public recommendations ever came from the CDC or from the 4 makers of Factor VIII. One of the 4, Alpha, says it actually attempted to put a warning label on Factor VIII in March of 1983, but the FDA said no.
Let's say, okay, you buy a lotion and your hand starts breaking out in a rash. You're not going to continue using that lotion. You're going to stop using it. I don't know what's causing that rash, but, you know, it sure seems like it's connected with this lotion, so I'm going to stop using it.
Colleen Wilson's hemophiliac son Matthew died of AIDS in 1995. She and the other hemophiliacs and their families we met with feel the companies should have known better. Do you blame the drug companies?
Yes.
Yes.
All of us do.
Very much so.
To a person. Yes.
They were murderers.
Absolutely.
They knew that whatever was causing AIDS was in blood.
You're saying these...
They could have withdrawn the product.
In your opinion, now you're unanimous about this.
Absolutely.
Yes.
In your opinion, these companies knowingly allowed
the tainted product to go forward, to be
Encouraged it.
Money.
knowing that people were going to get sick and die.
Yes.
They thought the cost of the lawsuits wouldn't offset the amount of lives. They thought they'd had a few % to deal with. It didn't turn out that way.
The companies emphatically deny these charges. The industry responded to Nightline with this statement. We are deeply sorry that the hemophilia community has been so devastated by HIV and AIDS. This is particularly tragic because HIV was transmitted by the very therapies that people relied on to treat their hemophilia. At a time when no one knew that the virus entered the bloodstream, it is HIV that is the common enemy. The statement goes on. Our production and collection of plasma-based therapies has always met or exceeded the world's most stringent safety standards, and we have been at the forefront of developing new technologies which have made these therapies safer still. In 1984, the blood product companies did indeed develop heat treatments to eliminate HIV and Factor VIII, and began the process once the FDA gave them approval. This also was the year in which the HIV virus was determined to be the cause of AIDS. By 1985, they were able to test factor VIII for HIV, but the industry insists they kept making and distributing non-heat-treated product that they knew was probably contaminated with HIV because physicians here and abroad were still asking for it. The reason is that there were risks from the process. Heat treatment, says the industry, reduced the amount of clotting factor in each dose, reducing its effectiveness. But even more importantly, says the industry, there was a higher potential for the body to reject factor VIII totally, leaving hemophiliacs with no effective treatment. A heartbreaking dilemma. Risk a deadly bleed with cryo or risk AIDS with HIV-infected factor VIII. Risk factor VIII that is free of HIV, but then risk becoming immune to any kind of clotting medicine. Hard choices, real risks. Only hemophiliacs and their families say they wish that they had had the latest information on AIDS. That way they themselves could have made the choice of which risk to take.
This is ABC News Nightline, brought to you by Prudential.
Japanese blood company executives on bended knee in 1996, expressing what they say is their deep regret. They told customers as late as 1986 that non-heat-treated factor VIII was safe, according to a Japanese court. About 2,000 Japanese hemophiliacs were infected with HIV. About 500 have died of AIDS so far, and nearly all of the infected factor VIII was produced here in the United States. Other such shipments went overseas, including to Hong Kong. The Far East marketing manager for Cutter Laboratories wrote his regrets in May 1985 for not being able to convert a Hong Kong customer to heat-treated product. But he also writes, "Be assured there is no severe hazard from the regular factor VIII concentrate now being supplied in Hong Kong and numerous other countries. It is the same fine product we have supplied for years."
It was a lie that it was the same old good old stuff. It was the same stuff, but it was the same stuff that is killing people.
Tom Dries resigned as president of Alpha in 1983 and has been an expert witness on behalf of hemophiliacs and their families in over 75 lawsuits.
It was really silly when you look at it because they destroyed a whole generation of hemophiliacs who would have been customers. That was dumb.
And there is this Cutter memo summarizing a May 1985 meeting in which an FDA official expresses concern that the industry is still licensed to make and distribute non-heat-treated product. The FDA's Harry Meyer was quoted as saying that the FDA had allowed this situation to continue for so long, and he, Meyer, would like to see the issue quietly solved without alerting the Congress, the medical community, and the public. Later, in a sworn deposition, Meyer denied ever using those words. For its part, the industry points out that they were not licensed to sell heat-treated product in many of the countries because the countries were concerned about the dangers of heat treatment. In addition, they stopped manufacturing non-heat-treated factor VIII in 1984. And by mid-1985, they had stopped shipping all non-heat-treated product anywhere and offered to take back all of the non-heat-treated factor VIII for credit. It was a constant assessment of risk around the globe. In this country, as many as 11,000 out of the 20,000 hemophiliacs who use factor VIII never got HIV. And, says Don Francis, risk had always been part of life for hemophiliacs.
Before, hemophiliacs had a risk of hepatitis. Now they have a risk of AIDS, and that's just what it comes for the convenience of using this material. And it was all kind of accepted by not just the companies. It was accepted by, in many ways, the hemophiliacs. It was accepted by the doctors and the producers of the material, saying that this was the price of this wonderful product that allowed your kid to go out and play football.
But there would have been virtually no price to pay had the companies heat-treated factor VIII to eliminate the hepatitis virus, which was present in factor VIII years before HIV came along. A heat treatment that a 1997 Institute of Medicine report concluded could have been developed before 1980. The companies disagree, claiming the technology simply was not available back then. 3 out of 4 of the Pipert brothers died of AIDS through factor VIII. Despite evidence the industry tried to put the risk of AIDS in proper perspective early on, their mother May remains unconvinced.
The drug companies didn't call, they didn't warn you, they didn't do anything in the beginning. And I think that's a crime that reaches to heaven for retribution. People, you know, we trusted them, and my boys trusted them with their lives, and they lost their lives because of it.
When we come back, we'll talk with a veteran science journalist who spent 6 years researching the history of the blood supply. Co-director of the science journalism program at Boston University, Professor Starr traveled to 9 countries and spent 6 years researching and writing his recent book, Blood, An Epic History of Medicine and Commerce. He joins us from our Boston bureau. Professor Starr, good evening. Let me start by asking you, there are hemophiliacs and their families who believe that the companies intentionally refused to warn them so that they could profit. Do you think there's any truth to that? Were you able to prove it?
I think there were things they failed to do, but I wouldn't put it quite as starkly as that. I think when they found out what they needed to do in order to prevent the spread of the disease, they did it. I think they could have been a little more forthcoming with the patients and including them in the information loop so people could start to make their own judgments about what they should do.
What about the duty to warn? Did these companies, did the federal government have a duty to warn people when they in fact found out that the products were contaminated?
I think everybody did. It's a little complicated. People were dealing with a retrovirus, which is a relatively new thing, and there was a lot of circumstantial evidence that they were dealing with a virus before they actually found the virus. You were dealing with a medicine that essentially doubled people's lifespans, so companies and to a degree even patients were reluctant to give it up. So there was a degree of denial with people finding it difficult to believe that this wonderful medicine could have been contaminated.
This didn't just happen here in the U.S. It also happened abroad, particularly in France and Japan. Compare what happened in those countries to what happened here in the U.S.
In France, the Transfusion Service, which is a government entity, covered up what they had to do for quite some time. When there was the availability of American heat-treated product, they didn't let it within the borders, and they delayed for many months the availability of the safe product. It was even worse in Japan, where the government actively covered up the fact that AIDS even existed.
The French and the Japanese did acknowledge on some level that it seems that Americans haven't, the extent of the harm that was done.
Mm-hmm. What happened was the scandals in France and Japan were so catastrophic that they led to these national uproars and trials, and people were indicted and people went to jail, and there were big compensation packages. So in a sense there was a catharsis in both of those countries. In this country, for a number of reasons, the issues kind of bubbled along in a quiet way, and I don't think the victims have ever really been given the kind of sympathy or acknowledgement that they deserve.
You've actually met with victims throughout the research for your book. Tell us a little bit about your experience.
Well, it was a terrible thing. I mean, here were people, here were mothers who injected their little boys with a product that was supposed to save their lives and essentially killed them. And the survival guilt is just terrible. And it's interesting to see what a change took place. You know, in years past, the drug companies and the Hemophilia Foundation and the patients were like one big family. And they would have their annual conventions and picnics because they needed each other. I was at one of their conventions in 1993, and it was a very different story. You know, there were signs vilifying the companies, there was screaming, you know, accusations, how could you have killed my son? There were ghastly protests, and it was just an awful situation.
What were the lessons learned by this, and do you think that were there to be a blood-borne virus again, it would be stopped in a more efficacious manner?
I think the lessons learned have to do with sort of a subtle failure to act. I think when the drug companies started taking measures, they exaggerated the efficacy of what they were doing. One example was a drug company that said, we've closed our San Francisco plasma collection center, but they neglected to mention that just across the bay in Berkeley, there was another collection center. One company closed a center that was in a high-risk neighborhood, but they saved the inventory. So they weren't as honest with the patients as they could have been, even though they acted in a very, in a sense, admirable way.
Professor Starr, after 6 years of research, are there villains here?
No, I think there are humans here. There are fallible humans, some of whom tried to do the right thing, some of whom had mixed motives and couldn't sort it out. I think one thing that the AIDS crisis did was paint the dangers of complacency in very stark contrast. So I doubt that people will be complacent again.
Professor Starr, thank you for joining us this evening.
Thank you.
I'll be right back with a closing thought in a moment. We must acknowledge that if what hemophiliacs charge is true, the makers of Factor VIII and various government officials were not the only ones failing in their responsibilities at the beginning of the AIDS epidemic. The media, too, were slow to understand and report the story. As May Piper had asked the producer of this program, where were you? Nightline is grateful to her and all of the hemophiliacs and their families who shared with us their pictures, home movies, their pain, their loss, and their grief. Many we spoke to still believe that the makers of Factor VIII intentionally caused the deaths of so many loved ones. There may be evidence out there to provide hemophiliacs and their families the justice they seek in the courts. So far, it hasn't happened. This is a cautionary tale. When all is said and done, it does seem fair for the public to expect these companies and their government regulators to know the early warning signs of a blood-borne epidemic in the making, and to make sure that information is made public. That's our report for tonight. I'm Cynthia McFadden in Washington for all of us here at ABC News. Good night.
This has been a presentation of ABC News. More Americans get their news from ABC News than from any other source.